political science and urban studies, and I spent the last year in Bogotá, Colombia as an English teaching assistant. And I'm interested in issues of education, segregation, and state violence.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. We're all really eager to hear you all and help start, inspire, and continue some very important conversations about race. I'm excited to hear everyone's views because I know you're all really invested in the fight for justice, and I'm going to try to ask questions objectively and play a little bit of devil's advocate here and there, just to raise some points that a lot of people are probably thinking about. But to get us started, I wanted to discuss issues regarding racism as more of a systemic issue. And just to give a little bit of context, I think it would be helpful to ground this discussion in a little bit of history. So slavery started in 1619 when Americans literally looted and stripped people from their homes and brought them to America. They were treated as less than property, given different names, put to work in inhumane conditions in a system where they lacked any and all rights. They were stripped of their culture, barred from learning to read, write, beat, killed for attempting to escape, and had absolutely no rights. And after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed to end slavery, what happened to all of these people whose families bore this cruelty for 200 years? Like, they weren't given any reparations like they were promised. They were expected to just go off and build a life without any support, while white former slave owners were given reparations because of the burden that they bore for losing their property. Systemic racism didn't go away magically. It morphed into Black code, segregation, Jim Crow laws, convict leasing, which are just institutionalized forms of discrimination where Black people weren't given the same rights. So, it's really been difficult to see this history. And we learn about these inequities and are taught about the civil rights movement at school, and the civil rights movement was definitely very important, and not a lot of South Asians are really taught about how valuable this was to our communities. I know it's been missing from my education while growing up. We aren't taught that a Black man named Rustin directed the Free India Committee and fought to end British rule in India, or that the civil rights movement was heavily involved in fighting to eliminate quotas that barred immigration and allowed millions of South Asian immigrants, including a lot of our families, to come to America in the first place. And while the civil rights movement was a really important feat, just think about how that's translated to today. Here we are in 2020, more than 400 years since the first slaves were brought here, and we're witnessing over and over again acts of injustice against the Black community, which really illuminate that racism is a systemic issue. And in response to this notion, a lot of people say things like, Obama is Black and became president. That's proof that racism doesn't exist. Or these incidents are unfortunate, but isolated. We have equal opportunity and everyone just needs to work harder. So I was hoping to open this discussion up now about how racism could be systemic. And I wanted to start with asking Rupsha, can you please explain your views on whether or not racism is solely just personal bias or a systemic problem, and maybe explain the difference between the two?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mithali. First I want to preface everything I say with all of these concepts are well written about. There are entire libraries full of literature on this. I'm not an expert on any of this. In fact, almost all of this I was first introduced to in college. And just to echo what Mithali said earlier, that all of the thought on this, not all of the thought on this, but a significant amount of the thought on this is because of the work of Black scholars in this country and Black activists. And the only reason that I know about this is because of their work. So if you want to learn more about this, don't take my word for any of it. Go out and read about it. It's so easy to find information today. Go out and educate yourself. So your question is about basically the difference between individual interpersonal prejudice and racism or systemic racism. So I think it's important to maybe define a few terms first. So on a very basic level, if you remember nothing else, the key difference is power. So prejudice is prejudice, and racism is prejudice plus power, or discrimination plus power. So a lot of people believe in this misconception that racism requires conscious hate of a certain group or a conscious belief of superiority, which is not true, because racism refers to a system that gets perpetuated through pretty much cultural inheritance and institutional inheritance. So first, let's talk about prejudice. Prejudice is simply holding a belief toward a group of people that's not necessarily based on reason or experience. You could also say prejudice is kind of like a bias, and it's not exclusive to race. You can have prejudices against unathletic people or lawyers. Discrimination is when you take actions based on prejudice. And it's also not necessarily a bad thing. So let's take kind of an absurd example. I could say that I'm prejudiced against ugly looking fruit. So when I go to the supermarket, I only select fruit that I believe is not ugly. So I discriminate against ugly fruit, which is more or less a harmless form of discrimination, leaving, issues about food waste aside. So now, in the realm of people, let's say that I have a prejudice against dating someone who makes less money than I do. So this could be unconscious or conscious. Like for whatever reason, someone is perfect in every way, but at the end of the day, I just won't date them if they earn less money than me. So this starts to get a little more complicated, because decisions and date whoever I want to, and it shouldn't necessarily hurt anybody. But now let's say that I make a lot of money and I hold a position of power in society. So now let's say that there are a lot of people with my similar status who unconsciously hold this belief. So then you suddenly start to see a society where rich people are only marrying rich people and poor people are only marrying poor people, which is in fact pretty common in society, not as a general rule. So this is an example kind of like in the realm of class, but it seems natural to people because people from common backgrounds can relate to each other better and have maybe a mutual cultural language. But you start to see that suddenly all the positions in power, like say me and my husband and all of our friends who hold similar positions of power, be it the power to hire guide institutions or lead within our professions, suddenly we are unconsciously making decisions that actually are more likely to benefit us than other people. And it accrues in such a way that people who are not within our sort of like social milieu are shut out of resources. Now, of course, in the context of class, there are hundreds of factors that contribute to classism. So I'm just using this as kind of an example of how an interpersonal prejudice can reflect institutional power. So when institutional prejudice combines with institutional power and affects people's access to resources. So now let's talk about race. So similarly, racism is a system of racial prejudice and discrimination when it has structural systems and institutions of power behind it that affect people's access to resources. So you can't really talk about race, especially in America, without talking about white supremacy, because when we're talking about race, we're not actually talking about someone's biological or genetic race. Race is actually a political category, a category that has been constructed by humans for the purpose of kind of organizing society. And it is a direct descendant of white supremacy as defined centuries ago and established centuries ago through a colonial system. So what does white supremacy mean? White supremacy is not, a lot of people also kind of think that white supremacists are the KKK and that's it. However, white supremacy, again, is not necessarily meant to reflect conscious hate. It's the idea that we live in a system that continues to privilege and give power to white people or those in our society that we have ascribed whiteness to. So this is reflected in not only like literal positions of power, like representatives in your government, but also who's reflected in media and who's making, decisions on a smaller scale and who's afforded that kind of cultural capital. So the last thing I want to say is that obviously in the United States, we're specifically talking about in this context with the Black Lives Matter movement, we are specifically talking about Black and Indigenous people. And there's a lot of history and educational material about why the structures of white supremacy cannot really exist without structures that uphold anti-Black racism. So now you might be thinking, well, I'm not a white person. So how can I be a white supremacist? Or how can I be upholding a structure or a society of white supremacy? Okay, so let's take away white people then and imagine you're in India. So in India, we have our own forms of racism that predate colonialism because of our history with the caste system. So calling that racism maybe is like a little bit of a misnomer because the term race is really a product of white supremacy and British colonialism. But like within our own country, we have biases that are more like ethnocentric and religious because of the caste system and kind of like ethno-religious conflict. But we also have in our country, despite the fact that we ousted British colonial rule 60 years ago, more than 60 years ago, we also have descendants. We also have a kind of like descendants of white supremacy, where we still kind of uphold structures that value whiteness in an implicit way. So colorism is a great example of this. Colorism is the idea that people with lighter skin somehow implicitly tend to hold more power, and whether or not it's like a moral designation, there is rampant colorism in India. So that's kind of an example of how even in a homogenous country where there are no white people in positions of power, all the people of power in India are Indians, that society still in a way upholds white supremacy because of how rampant and implicit some of these structures are that we don't even realize. So that's just a very, very brief overview of these concepts that from my understanding and based on what I have learned, but really complicated. So please educate yourself.
Yeah, thank you for that overview. And I think it is important as people are reflecting on just structures of oppression around them to think about different communities. And I like that you brought up the example of how these structures can manifest in India. But this can manifest in the caste system, all of the protests with the Citizenship Amendment Act, but by no means does focusing solely on that mean we should detract from some of the important conversations we're also having right now around Black Lives Matter. And I think it is important to critically examine all of these oppressive structures and institutions when we're thinking about racism as not just interpersonal bias, but structures of oppression. And so I want to now ask, try to contextualize today and how we see that in our everyday society. So I was hoping, Rito, that you could maybe share a little bit about how you see racism pervading in the healthcare sector and in healthcare. I know you've written a piece on how COVID-19 is like not the great equalizer. So I think that's a good area to start so we can see how these structural forms are impacting the Black community.
For sure. Thank you, Mithali. And thank you, Ruksha. That was a great overview. And
Like you said, I think it's useful and worthwhile to kind of zoom into each of these institutions to see how these types of systemic issues play out. So I think healthcare is a great one to start with because, people consider it to be this kind of purely altruistic, area where all patients are treated equally and ideally all outcomes are the same. But in reality, that's really not the case at all. So let me give you some stats. So the average lifespan for a Black person in America is 6 years less than a white person. A Black woman is 71% more likely to die from cervical cancer, which is an easily kind of preventable thing because of screening protocols than a white person. And this is really the most shocking, in my opinion. A Black woman is 243% more likely to die from pregnancy or childbirth-related causes than a white woman. And then, moving on, like Black people are 40% more likely to have high blood pressure, twice as likely to have heart failure, 3 times more likely to have chronic kidney disease, and so on and so forth. You kind of get the picture. So why do these significant health disparities exist? And it's really 3 major buckets or categories. The first one, which is by far the least important, is our biological differences. So genetics or any sort of biological differences cannot even come close to explaining the dramatic gap in health outcomes between Black and white individuals. We know this because if you look at other countries, these types of gaps don't exist, at least to the degree that they do in the US. So it can't all be explained by biological differences. The second category is this concept of social determinants of health. So these are factors like, education, poverty, housing, access to healthcare, access to food even. So these external factors that directly drive and contribute to an individual's health. And the reality is that in the US, because of some of the things that we'll hopefully get into over the course of this conversation and some of the things that Mithali mentioned early on, the Black community is worse off really across the board in each of those categories. And so as a result of that, there's less wealth in the Black community, there's worse environmental conditions, there's worse access to care, and just less education. And all of these lead to more environmental exposures and riskier, health behaviors, things like smoking, poor nutrition, et cetera, which drives more disease and down the line kind of leads to more mortality and more morbidity. However, even if you control for age, gender, geography, employment, and a whole host of other socioeconomic factors, Black patients still have worse outcomes than white patients, which means there's something else in the equation that we're not capturing or understanding. And that brings me to the third factor, which is implicit bias. So healthcare professionals are humans that are raised in American society, which historically dehumanizes and treats Black patients and Black individuals as lesser than. So studies have shown that Black patients receive fewer pain medications, undergo fewer procedures, and receive less treatment for legitimate complaints, receive less explanation for any of the procedures or any of the care that they receive, and overall receive poorer quality of care compared to white and other patients. In fact, I recently saw this really distressing study that showed that a surprising number of medical students in the United States still believe that Black patients feel less pain than white patients or other patients because their skin is thicker, which obviously is a ridiculous assertion and has no data behind it. So kind of these factors and these issues, like healthcare as an institution is not immune to them. And if it has even reached a field like healthcare where, there's no, there's supposed to be kind of no systemic denial of any of resources or of care based on how someone looks. Imagine how badly these types of issues affect, other institutions in our country. So I had a lot more to say about kind of the racist past of medicine and also the role of stress in driving health outcomes. But I think I'll leave it at that and obviously open to any questions.
Thank you so much for sharing. I think that was a really good overview about how, some of these statistics really bring to light the problem of how many disparities there are in our healthcare system and how it was structured. And I think another really good example of how racism can be really systemic and pervade in different structures is in the education system. So I was hoping to reach out to Maya and talk a little bit about how early systemic racism can start. Why is it that there are higher suspension and dropout rates for Black students, and why some schools even today are practically almost segregated? You can still see that. So can you comment a little bit on your perspective, please?
For sure. So I think the two things that you called out right there, Mitali, are like clear examples of how systemic racism is very deeply embedded in the education system. It shouldn't come as a surprise that like suspension rates are much more targeted towards our students of color, and especially students of color who are boys. Like Black boys are 3 times more likely to get suspended or even expelled than their white students who commit even like similar infractions. And then if you look at the number of Black students who are just immediately just thrown into and getting evaluated and being diagnosed with like special needs, it's grossly disproportionate. And then also, there is segregation happening in our country around schools, like with redlining, and that segregation is really is resulting in funding resources too. So something that I am constantly struggling with as an administrator now is lack of resources and lack of funding. So the school that I work at does serve predominantly students who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And we are located in an area in the Bay that typically does get ignored, does not have the best resources, has been called the armpit of the city by police officers and by our local leaders too. So funding is definitely a huge issue, and it is definitely something that stems from a lot of the systemic racism that is infiltrating our schools. And the reasoning behind that is there's just so many layers to it too, because like as a teacher, when you're teaching students of color and when you're teaching families who are coming from disadvantaged backgrounds, it's really hard to think through like how is what I'm doing as a teacher, is it enough? Because the biggest source of burnout for teachers at my school, for teachers who work in and serve in demographics and areas like this, is the burnout really stems from lack of resources and lack of access. Like we are trying so hard and we are dedicated, but we are constantly faced with setbacks from lack of funding, lack of resources, lack of acknowledgement from our government leaders and from our federal government, federal sources of aid, that it becomes really, really hard to create an equitable playing field for our students of color compared to their white, more affluent counterparts. And access is so determined by the zip code that you live in. And it's really frustrating too, because when you are teaching, access isn't just what resources are available at school. There's generational gaps in access as well. Because, if I'm working with this student and then the student goes home, the separation between school and home is so vast, because when a student goes home, because of the systemic racism and all the systemic setbacks, their parents probably don't have a solid education to be able to help their child. And that is stemming from because they were also oppressed. They did not receive proper education. They probably were suspended, dropped out. And so it's really difficult to find ways to gain support from the people who have the access and the people who have the power. And I really feel like schools definitely need to be funded more. And it really starts, because racism really starts young. No child is born as a racist. No child is born with these biases. They are learned, and so much of that learning happens in schools. And it happens from the messages that get sent to them, from the communities that they live in. And yeah, I think there definitely needs to be a change in how we address. If we want to tackle systemic racism, it needs to start in schools. It needs to start at home, and the conversations that parents and kids are having at home, and then bringing it to schools so that it can have a larger impact when these kids grow up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like the point you brought up about these generational gaps that are happening. You know, the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap right now is so much built on these generational divides because there were never any reparations for Black people. There was redlining, as you mentioned, where communities that were predominantly Black were sort of deemed to not have good property value. So the property value was low, the property taxes funded the schools, and that's a main reason why a lot of these lower income community schools are less funded and don't have the access. And I think something that's also really interesting, I know Sanoja, you've done some research on this, is about, you know, the perspective of the South Asian community in this racial education like gap that we see. And could you maybe comment on why a lot of South Asian students and parents sort of exist as part of the predominantly non-Black, more diverse, better funded school communities? I know you have some research that you did there in college.
Yeah, so a lot of my research has focused on the connection between housing and school segregation. Something that I find myself really frustrated in with conversations of segregation is that, one, it's positioned legally and within, sorry, there's a dog barking outside. One with like legally and within like by national institutions as a fundamentally Black and Latinx problem, as if the only segregated schools are Black and Latinx schools, and it doesn't position what the real issue is the proliferation of majority white schools that hoard all of these resources. And I think what is really a really damaging development is the way in which South Asians and Asian Americans generally buy into the system and perpetuate the system. So for example, I can speak from where I live in Long Island, New York, which is one of the most segregated places in America. And a lot of that segregation happens because of the school districts, because of the ways in which people buy their houses and the ways in which real estate agents direct those properties, and then all these other things about like where houses are placed, where you can find affordable housing, et cetera, et cetera. And a recent investigation found that a lot of real estate agents, besides two in the island, there's a huge study done over 5 years, Black and white buyers were directed entirely other ways. And Asian buyers aligned with the white buyers in the ways in which they're directed to better school districts. And on top of that, Asians, a high Asian population of a district, connoted a better school. And so a lot of this is not only built on like achievement of schools, but also just reputations of schools, which are really racially connoted. And I think that, as South Asians who are really interested in addressing these systemic issues, we have to understand that maybe we don't have a right to buy a public education that is good based on its exclusion of Black and brown communities, Black and Latinx communities, Indigenous communities. So I think that's like a really big thing about, okay, what are the actions that we're taking in this moment and what do our communities do and how does it really buy into the system and support it?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And I think this whole discussion on these systemic issues really shows that even if we're seeing some sets, like some sources of Black progress, there are still systems that are built legally, as we discussed, just systematically built on bias, et cetera, that do exclude Black people. So saying some of these comments about, oh, you should just work harder, sort of blames people for their own oppression if it is systemically built. And I think the point that you brought up about like where our role is as a South Asian community is something I wanted to touch on next. And I think that there's a common sentiment amongst a lot of non-Black people that, I'm not Black. Why does this matter to me? And I think a lot of times we are either complicit in structures like you were mentioning, or we just sort of ignore the issue and remain apolitical. And so I was wondering if someone could speak to maybe how this sentiment can be tackled and how to encourage solidarity with the movement.
I guess I can say just a few things building off of what you actually said in the beginning, which is that much of the reason that the South Asian community is here and immigrated here is due to civil rights legislation, and particularly the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. And I would add on to that pretty much every non-discrimination law that South Asian communities benefit from is a result of Black activists and leaders, not just from the civil rights movements, but after that. And so there's a lot of things that Black activists have done in helping our communities like buy our houses and be able to go to work and file discrimination complaints and have access to schools and so many parts of the things that we take for granted. I mean, all of these, not all, but like so much of this fight was done by Black Americans. And I think there's some level of solidarity that can be built just by recognizing and being educated in that, which, you know, we're not. So that's not necessarily like all of our faults, but I think that's the work we have to do.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think a lot of the bystanderism is also kind of a result of not understanding history, but also just not critically reflecting in our own identities and our place in society and what we make of all of these biases and relations. And this is a really big concept that is blowing up now. It's always sort of been there. There's this concept called like fragility, where it's taboo to talk about race, and we don't feel comfortable. We don't want these uncomfortable conversations about racism, so we don't really feel the need to engage critically in a lot of issues. And I was hoping that we could just discuss a little bit how we can confront this fragility we have. Why should we step out of our comfort zones? Why are we scared to do so? How can we engage in that?
Natalia, I can take, I'd like to share some of my thoughts on that. So, I mean, that's something that I personally as well, because, you know, growing up as an American-born Indian in a predominantly white area, you know, my own identity was something that was really troubling. The reason I had so many struggles was because, you know, at home, it was never really talked about. And I imagine that is the case for South Asian kids who grew up in America. It's just not talked about at home. And, you know, at least from my perspective and from some of my friends' perspectives who grew up similar to me, you know, the focus is more on like achievement than identity. So it's like, you know, just, it doesn't matter, just focus on your studies, you know, get a good job and you'll be fine. But there are so many like layers to that. It's like, well, how can you achieve without first exploring your identity, first understanding like where do you fall in this spectrum, where are you and who are you and how, but more so not who you are, but how are others going to see you and how are their biases and so it is really hard, and I'm really excited to be part of this panel. I'm really excited to see like fellow brown people talking about an issue like this, because this is something that has personally been missing from my childhood, and been missing from like, you know, I've had really amazing, powerful discussions about race and about social justice with other people, but not necessarily with my brown people. And I think there's a reason for that. And I think it really just stems from, I actually don't know what it stems from, but from my opinion or from my perspective, I think it stems from, you know, just benefiting from this, you know, model minority myth, right? So like, I think we as Indian people, like we benefit from a lot of this model minority, like, oh, you know, Indian people, like you are probably in tech or you probably have a good education, you know, your parents are well educated, you know, you came to this country by choice. But, you know, back to what Sanoja said too, right? Like, if you're sitting here watching this and you're comfortable and you're in a nice home think about like why you're here and how you got here and all the people and, you know, the advocacy and the civil rights that led you to have this comfortable life. When you think of that, when you know the truth, it's really hard to ignore. And so like, I think a lot of people don't realize the benefits that they are currently experiencing are because of the sacrifices and the hardships that Black people faced. And once you know that, and once you really like that sinks in, it becomes impossible to ignore.
Thank you. And I think something that you brought up that particularly has been really challenging for a lot of people is, you know, how do we have these conversations with loved ones, you know, friends and family who, you know, this is for some people, this is like the first time we've critically engaged and like critically analyzed our own identities and our place in society, or how our relationship is to other systems of oppression, what those systems of oppression are for other groups of people, particularly the Black community. Do any of you guys have any tips or guidance on how we can have these conversations in a productive way so as not to close people off?
I think I had a thought about that. One kind of barrier to understanding that I've encountered when I've, you know, had these types of conversations with, I guess, the older generation is that there's almost this like instinctive defensiveness, because saying that, you know, Indians have benefited from the work of, you know, Black activists and the Black community, or that we have an inherent advantage because we are Indian or South Asian, kind of makes people defensive, because they feel that we are kind of delegitimizing their hard work. And I think it's important to like in these conversations as kind of even a rhetorical strategy to like, you know, acknowledge that our parents and the elder generation did work hard. And we're not saying that they did not work hard to get to where they are. It's just that being brown or being South Asian wasn't one of the things that they had to necessarily overcome to the same degree that, you know, Black folks have to overcome their being Black, if that makes any sense. I know that was kind of convoluted, but I think it's framing the discussion in a way that says, you know, we benefit from these power structures because, I mean, clearly, I mean, Indians are the wealthiest minority group in the US. And like, I know, like Sanoja mentioned, and like Maya has mentioned, some of the stereotypes about, you know, South Asians are overwhelmingly positive, right? So this whole idea of the model minority myth, right? We benefit from it, we buy into it, and white people in society to eliminate our shared experiences with Black people as people of color in this country, but also weaponize kind of the differences, right? People say, oh, look, if, you know, Indian people came to this country and they're getting ahead, how come you can't as well? So I think, I guess my point is just in conversations, be sensitive to acknowledge that by saying that Indians benefit from this privilege, it's not saying that you didn't work hard. It's saying that there were kind of these hidden things that you benefited from that make it such that and maybe a Black person with the exact same drive, the exact same education, the exact same everything across the board would not have gotten as far as you did. And it's worth acknowledging that and fighting to make it so that everyone has equal opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That was really well put. Rucha, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think Rita, you did a great job of explaining some of those things that I kind of wanted to add to. So I find a lot of the time that in conversations with South Asians, there's this inclination to center ourselves in discussions about racism and kind of distract from the issue. So for example, right now in this political moment, movement right now about Black lives and systemic racism that specifically impacts Black people. And I find this inclination to say like, oh, well, I experienced racism too as a South Asian person. So it's important to understand that when there's a movement like this happening, no one is denying that you also experience racism, and no one is detracting from that. But as some of the things that Rito mentioned, racism against us does not look like the same as racism against Black and Indigenous people, and that's partially because of history. It's partially because of institutions in this country specifically that are by design meant to exclude Black and Indigenous people. So while at the same time, we have not seen the generational effects of those institutions. But so on the one hand, we benefit from discrimination legislation and things like that Black people have campaigned for. So it is really complicated, but really try hard not to center yourselves in these conversations, because while anti-Indian sentiment is obviously a huge problem and something that we should be talking about in our own communities and holding white people and other people who hold these prejudices accountable, it's not really productive to center ourselves, because ultimately the model minority myth is something that can also hurt us too. And if we participate in dismantling anti-Black racism and white supremacy and are in solidarity with Black people, it is far more productive than trying to individualize our racial struggle. And then the last thing I want to say on this is that I have personally had really, really acrimonious arguments with my parents about these topics. And so I've gone through a lot of, reflection and learning about how to have productive conversations about this and how to not devolve these conversations into ad hominem or bitter arguments. And so a lot of the times I feel like, especially in Indian and South Asian communities, we hold education to be so important. We care, we invest so much in sending our children to good colleges and making sure they have a good education. A lot of people in the generation above me, I feel, get a little bit defensive and resentful when their children use that education to then challenge some of the beliefs that they hold. And so one thing that I want to communicate is that when your children or when people in the younger generation are holding you accountable for those things, it's not meant to be a personal attack against you. It's not meant to, they're not ungrateful for the education that you've provided them. In fact, they're ever more grateful that you provided them that education so they were now able to see all these injustices around them. And the reason they're bringing these up to you is because they want you to, become better people in the way that they've benefited from their, elite educations. And it doesn't mean that they don't love you if they're pointing out things that that maybe you're doing to uphold anti-Black racism and white supremacy. So that's something really important to keep in mind.
Thank you. That was also really well said, and I appreciate the personal reflection. I think it's something that we've all been sort of struggling with, and navigating these conversations is really important. I think a lot of times also when we're reflecting internally, even if we're critically engaging with literature and speaking to other people, we can, I think there are two things. I think first, we internally sort of reflect and say, like, we're not racist. But I guess my question is that enough? Is it okay to just be not racist? I think there's a difference between non-racism and also anti-racism. And I was hoping that we could also discuss those differences and explain what that means, because we're hearing all of these chants about silence is violence, like we're complicit in structures, but we're also reflecting and saying, I'm not doing anything, like I'm not the problem. And I think a lot of people, while having these discussions, do feel defensive because of this divide. So I was hoping we could clear up and maybe have a discussion on what it means to be non-racist and what it means to be anti-racist. Does anyone want to take on that?
So I just spoke, but I'm happy to take this on unless someone else wants to jump in. Okay, so I think the very, very first thing, especially if these concepts are relatively new to you, is to just read about them. You know, information is so easy to access these days. If you need guidance, I am always happy to send things that have really affected the way I think. Like, feel maybe at the end of this we can go around and provide our emails, but like reach out to people. No one is going to deny you access to educational resources. So it's really important that you go out and seek them yourselves. And then something that other people have said before also is that don't get defensive when these topics come up, because that really is so unproductive, and it distracts from the issues at hand. When someone points something out to you, just try to sit with the discomfort that you feel and reflect on it instead of being reactionary to it. And then maybe in your own time, read about it and try to understand how you maybe like internalized some aspects of white supremacy. And then also, this is like a constant thing because white supremacy is so ingrained in our institutions. It's not, you can't ever really just say that I'm an anti-racist. It's more of a practice. And I kind of like to compare it to the way that yoga is also a practice. You know, in the sort of like yogic tradition, there is really no such thing as mastering yoga or achieving perfection. And that's very much analogous to what it means to practice anti-racism. It means to constantly be questioning your internal biases. It means constantly holding people around you, the institutions around you, the people in your profession around you accountable, constantly educating yourself. You know, even though I have studied these things for some years now, I find myself learning about things every single day. Like even within my own profession, I just found out I'm going to be a lawyer in a few years. I just found out a couple of weeks ago that the bar exam was specifically designed to keep Black people out of the legal profession. So yeah, I would just say that constantly keep trying to educate yourself about it because it's everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think it's important to just continuously ask yourself questions, interrogate things. And I think another point about this is just to be active and not passive. I think that's the main difference between being not racist and being anti-racist, is that you're stepping up, you're taking some sort of action, whether it's some action internally or something more externally, depending on where you are in this journey of social justice realization and identity politics understanding. And just another point, I think it's important that we all be cognizant of the rhetoric that we're using. I think a lot of times there are instances in which we might make comments that we think are okay, but might be interpreted as like a microaggression for others. So I think it's important to just be cognizant of some of this language. I know we may have heard it in our community, things like you were saying with some of the stereotypes of, oh, like she's really good at tech, you must be going into engineering. Or I think a common other example is when Black people are speaking and someone makes the comment of, oh, this person's so articulate. It's sort of like a presumption that maybe someone is not normally articulate and we wouldn't assume that. Or saying things like Blacks and whites instead of like Black people or the Black community, sort of homogenizes groups together. So I think as we're engaging and reading literature, it's also important to think about what sorts of rhetoric we're using, because these are just sort of thinly veiled instances of bias or racism that we might not know that we're engaging in. So that's what I wanted to say on that bit. But just to sort of wrap up our discussion on, you know, why we as South Asians should care about this, I think another common, I guess, rebuttal or hesitancy is around what we're seeing in the protests on the media. We're seeing a lot of hypocrisy of people who previously protested, like for COVID reopening and lockdown, and now they're touting how important it is to stay at home. We've been seeing a lot of looting and violence, but I guess it's a little hard to wrap ourselves around. Why would we want to engage something in that nature that we perceive to be violent based on what we're seeing in the media, based on other accounts? So I was hoping that we could touch a little bit on what we should make of this violence, and is there a right way to protest?
So I can jump in unless someone else has something to add. So I think there's a lot of nuance to this, and there's not really a clear right answer. Should we, in terms of the violence, first of all, I think it's worth noting that it's really just a minority of individuals, right? Despite the fact that it's on the TV all the time, people are talking about it, but it's really a minority of protesters that are engaging in looting and this type of violence. But should we condone or support that aspect of the protests? Not necessarily, I suppose, but I think anytime there's widespread protests or demonstrations kind of this magnitude that have swept across the country and really across the world, I think you have to take a step back and think about why. So, what is the driving force? What is the motivation? And by the same token, when, this minority of people is turning to violence, you have to ask yourself, what is driving them to think of violence as their only recourse or looting as their only recourse? And I think the answer really is just anger, frustration, and just desperation, an absolute kind of mistrust of law enforcement and our criminal justice system overall. Imagine seeing, for the Black community, imagine seeing time after time after time, unarmed Black men, women, and children being, essentially killed or unjustly treated by police officers who are supposed to uphold, their best interests. So in terms of is there a right way to protest? There have been hundreds and hundreds of peaceful protests in the past. I think this is kind of an example I think most people will remember. I don't know how many people are sports fans who are listening, but Colin Kaepernick famously kneeled during the national anthem as a form of protest or to draw attention to the issue of police brutality. And he was widely criticized. And people said this is disrespectful. This is not, quote unquote, the right way to protest, right? Another sports example that comes to mind is LeBron James and a lot of the athletes in the NBA who are Black were wearing T-shirts that said, I can't breathe, after I believe it was the death of Michael Brown. And Laura Ingraham and a lot of other people, famously said, shut up and dribble. We don't really want to hear your opinion, right? So that apparently wasn't the right way to protest either. And even when the Black Lives Matter movement kind of first was gaining legs, immediately there was this rebuttal, right? No, all lives matter, not just Black lives. So basically, no matter how the Black community has attempted to peacefully kind of raise their concerns and fight against their perceived injustices, people who are kind of the oppressors in this kind of systemic, in the societal structure that oppresses them, have constantly kind of refused to listen and delegitimized their protests. So I think in the context of all of that, plus the fact that, a lot of people have, been sitting at home for months because of COVID, I think that, this was the final straw that kind of broke the camel's back and really is the culmination of really decades and centuries of systemic oppression that is manifesting now in people feeling that they have no choice but to turn to violence and looting. So I guess to summarize, while we shouldn't necessarily, no one's looking at the looting and the violence and saying, oh, that's a good thing necessarily. I think we have to really take a step back and ask why it's happening and focus more on, the cause, which is the destruction of human life, versus focusing on the destruction of property, which is what a lot of people are using to delegitimize the entire movement.
And I just wanted to add too, so this is a conversation that's difficult, and I know, and I've had my parents. One thing that I genuinely believe is that a lot of this is like, oh, but these are minority-owned small businesses that are being destroyed, which to some extent is true in cities like Philadelphia and some parts of Minneapolis. But the thing that affects minority-owned small businesses the most in this country isn't looters, it's big corporations like Amazon. And it's this idea that we don't seem to be caring about these small businesses until it can be used and weaponized against the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think that there's this real idea of okay, who is waging this and who is talking about this? And the other thing I'd like to add is that, as someone who has gone to a lot of protests and sees what's happening on the ground here, the police are incredibly violent. And there are countless videos from the past 2 weeks across the country of just really lots and lots of anger. So and I know in Long Island, even if protesters are being quote unquote what we call peaceful by the police's definition of peaceful, people are being arrested and being harassed by people saying, you don't even belong here, you're not from here, you're an outsider, you're an out. And so I think that there's some level of also things that are peaceful in the sense that they are walking and they're marching and they're in the street, which are totally legal and protected by our First Amendment rights, also being considered violent protests. And so the use of violence and peaceful as rhetorically is also quite problematic.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think both of those things were really great reflections. I think right now when we're seeing what's happening on the news, the media does sort of specifically focus on a lot of these violent cases. And I think the prioritization of a lot of people is, I'm really sorry that George Floyd died, but can we please stop destroying property, instead of, hey, it's really bad that we've destroyed some property that can be rebuilt, but Black lives can't, let's stop that. And I think that's the prioritization that sort of needs to be shifted a little bit in our conversations about protesting. But I wanted to touch on this point you brought up about the police, because, there's been a huge call to defund the police. And this is definitely a trickier issue, and a lot of people have differing opinions on this. So I think it's important for us to discuss, what does defund the police mean? What does this mean in terms of the criminal justice system? And so I was hoping to just, if we could speak a little bit about what the movement means in pretty objective terms to explain it, I think that would help start the conversation.
Yeah, so I just spoke, but if I can say a little bit. So I think the first thing that it's important to recognize when we think about defunding the police is, what do the police actually do? What functions do they serve? So right now, about 50% of encounters with police are traffic stops. The second biggest category after that is police going to traffic incidents. The third biggest category after that is police going and dealing with issues of mental illness and alcoholism. And the fourth category after that is police dealing with complaints about homelessness. So basically, the four biggest categories that make up the vast majority of policing work are things that I would argue, and that many people would argue, that discriminate against Black and brown residents and poor residents, and also are things that you generally don't need lethal force for. And bringing lethal force is already an escalation of the situation. And so I think defunding the police is a call that really recognizes that if this isn't a one bad apple problem, it's something that policing as a whole isn't working. And it serves to essentially the scale of policing and the mandate of police, 20, 30 years reform, prosecute Black and brown communities for very minor level offenses. So what defunding the is effectively reduce, and by reducing the scale of policing, we reduce the amount of violent encounters that Black people, for the majority, have with the police. And so another part of this is that is the whole budgetary aspect. So defunding the police has to do with our local budgets for the most part, county level, city. Many major cities, in many counties, police, and this is not including corrections, not including the prison system, not including the DA's office, but police make about a quarter to a third to almost a half of some of these budgets. It is an enormous amount of money that we're spending on the police. And so there's this idea that while looking at our budgets, by seeing what we're seeing right now, which is a huge deficit in our budgets because of the lack of sales taxes due to the coronavirus pandemic, what we want to see is, instead of seeing all these cuts go to social services, we want to see money be taken from the police and be reinvested into services such as housing, such as health, such as social services, such as education, that actually work to, make communities safer and tackle many of the forms of systemic racism that we've been discussing, and serve to essentially say, this is what gives people real security. And I think something that I really think about is Mariame Kaba, who's this is all, by the way, taken from like Black scholars and activists. I just want to say this 100%, like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Mariame Kaba, Critical Resistance, I can go on and on. But Mariame Kaba published this New York Times op-ed yesterday, which was like, yes, we really mean abolishing the police. And she said, we are not abandoning our communities to violence. We don't just want to abolish police departments, but we want to make them obsolete. And making them obsolete means that we don't want to live in a society where policing is required to make us feel safe. And I think that's a really important part about the defunding for police calls.
Can I
think, go ahead.
Sorry, Mithali. I was just going to add something really quick. Like, there's this saying kind of in the healthcare space, right? Like, the best hospital is one that puts itself out of business, right? The goal should be to treat people in a preventative fashion and sort of create conditions where nobody has to come in with acute issues, or nobody comes in with an exacerbation that could have been prevented, right? And I think what you're saying kind of echoes that as well, right? You want a police force that acts, so you want, before we abolish it entirely, you want a police force that creates a situation where they're needed less and less. And I think as a society, redirecting funds to actually solving the issues that are leading to crime in the first place is a more useful measure than just throwing more money at police, which are really just the Band-Aid, right? They're not fixing the underlying issues. So I'll just
I just want to add one thing that I forgot to mention. That's a really good point, and I think that really puts it well together. But there's another thing, which is like how police violence in itself is like just a really good reason to defund the police. I was doing some research, and so in the United States, 3/4 of homicides are committed by people who someone knows, who the victim knows. But out of the quarter that are committed by strangers, 1/3 of those are committed by police. So if someone is killed by a stranger in this country, it is a 1/3 chance that the person who killed them is a police officer. And to me, that is enough of an argument to say that we need to entirely reimagine a system in which that is a reality. So.
Yeah, and I think, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. I just want to add one thing. The idea, people have a really hard time, I found, imagining what defunding police actually looks like. And I saw some people online and like leaders in the space talking about it. Really, all you need to imagine is a suburb, like a wealthy, middle-class, wealthy community. Think about, if you live in one of these communities, think about how often you have encounters with the police. Speaking for myself, nearly never. We go out of our way in our communities to make sure that we don't interact with the police. And in fact, if we were to ever interact with the police or be subject to law enforcement, we go out of our way to make sure that that our children are kept out of the carceral system. Think about what would happen if your child were to be charged with a crime. You would do everything in your power to keep them out of jail and keep them out of prisons. And that's basically what we've done in suburbs. We've created communities where we invest more in education, we invest more in mental health care, we invest more in housing. And that's why children stay out of trouble. And when they are in trouble, we do everything in our power to make sure they don't enter the criminal justice system. So really, it's not that hard to imagine. It's not a radical or fantastical concept because it's already being implemented for wealthier communities.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think I just want to, I think my perspective on it is that the whole call to defund the police is fundamentally a reorientation in our values of how we can help people. Is it to just, there's a problem, send in the police to school. There's a drug problem, send in the police. Is it always to send in the police, or is it to tackle these root cause issues that might be leading to some of these problems? And I think the analogy you gave, Rupsha, was really good that, in a lot of communities, we don't send in the police to school, to all of these areas. And if there were a case, for instance, that, a child to rehab or send them to, if there are any problems, we would go to mental health specialists or go to substance abuse specialists. And the whole idea is more of a reinvestment in resources to community members who are better equipped to tackle these issues, because in a lot of cases, even police officers have noted that they are overburdened with all of these different instances in which people can call 911. And one point that I guess I wanted to raise in this discussion is, well, why can't we fund the police, but also fund these extra services like helping with homelessness and healthcare and any other social services? Why is it that we have to cut the police funding if we could just try to solve these root cause issues as well?
I can take that. I think it's the recognition that policing as it is fundamentally I think there's a really good quote. I will say there's a really good quote by Critical Resistance, which is that it's not that policing is broken, it's that it's working exactly as it's intended. It is working specifically to criminalize Black people in this country, Black and brown people in this country. And I think the recognition of policing at its scale being a real harm to communities, something which, the fact that we've only gotten to this point now of really questioning police, and my entire adolescence has been marked by watching videos of Black men being murdered and Black women being murdered on YouTube. That is just so horrifying in itself, that it's a recognition that this system in itself and how big it is and how many people it's putting into prisons and how many people feel unsafe in the system is enough just to say that we need to cut this budget. We need to. And I think the other part is a budgetary concern, which is that the fact is that money isn't endless. And what we have been seeing over the past 30, 40 years is a real redistribution of social service funds to the police and to law enforcement agencies. And so I think that there's also this idea that if we're looking at we're seeing right now humongous budget deficits across the nation. I don't think the solution is necessarily to raise revenue, raise tax revenues and put really high taxes on everyone all around. Maybe for other things, but in order to maintain the police budget and increase all these other forms of social spending, but to really see these things as very much connected in how we address issues.
Yeah, and I think another point on this is also just in general there's a lot of response about, why can't we just improve some of the policies for police? Why can't we ban chokeholds, which we've done in a lot of instances? Why can't we invest in more training? And why can't we, push these police reform policies? 99% of officers who have killed someone or have engaged in a crime sort of get let off free. So I guess my question is, why can't we just invest in more police training, or why can't these funds go towards good things that can help improve the conduct of police?
Does anyone else want to jump in? Or?
I can say one thing, just real quick. I was recently reading that I think it was Minnesota, really in 2015 or 2016, really tried a lot of these things. They I'm trying to remember, they instilled more implicit bias training, they diversified their force, they instituted, better kind of use of force standards, they mandated body cameras, they basically across the board, essentially they tried all of these things, and more training. And, a couple of years later, it hasn't really had much of an effect. And I think part of the reason is that like there's so much below the surface. We're just seeing the tip of the iceberg, right? Like the current iteration of law enforcement in this country is built on years and decades of public policy and kind of systemic issues that you can't undo by just changing a few policies at the downstream. So sorry, go ahead, Sanoja.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. So Minneapolis was one of the, in like Obama's reform at looking at police reform, was one of the major cities in this national procedural justice initiative. And what procedural justice really is this idea that like reform and better training will help the process, is like creates fairness in the process. And I think what sort of the new defunding calls recognizes that it's not that we need more fairness in the process, it's that the process itself is inherently unfair, and we need to maybe change the process itself. And so what we see is that training and like implicit bias training and things like this don't actually have any impact on the scale of policing or like what people actually police. Which I think is one of like, why is someone going in, why are 4 cops who are armed going in to a case of suspected forgery that wasn't even true? Like there are all these questions that we should be asking of like, why do we need this? And does this actually make us feel safe? So.
Yeah, I just want to add to like, I think the reason why I don't think, if we give the police money and we try to like establish like reform or whatever, it's not going to work. And I draw similarities to like protesting, right? Like, peaceful protests, like people, they tried to take a knee. They tried to just, do peaceful protests, and it wasn't gaining attention. It wasn't working, which is why people started to resort to looting and started to like resort to violence just to draw that attention. So just that drasticness is what's causing now like the whole nation, the whole world to like really draw attention to this issue, similarly to why defund the police. Like, we've tried it, we've done like the little soft steps, but now we need drastic action, just like the protesters had to take drastic action in order to feel heard.
Yeah, and another common pushback, I guess, is that, we have this, it's the Second Amendment right to carry a gun, not exactly carry a gun, but, we have the Second Amendment and there are a lot of bad people. How do protesters and people who are calling to defund the police sort of address the issues about people's safety concerns for those people who might be more inclined for violent crime? I think a lot of people understand or are wrapping their head around, why are we being so aggressive in our response to nonviolent crimes? But what about those few violent crime cases? What will happen in a world in which we do defund the police? How will society be equipped to take care of us and make us feel safe then?
Again, if anyone else has anything to say, but I think one thing that's really important is, okay, what does policing actually do and what does it say it does? So policing, for the most part, is really something that is about crime response, which is about police officers going and responding to the scene of a crime once it already happens. Police like to say that they're doing things about crime reduction and crime prevention, but the actual data behind whether or not these things are reducing crime is incredibly weak. So I think there's a lot to say. And there's a lot more data to show that and I mean, crime statistics themselves are like quite suspect in the way they're actually collected by police who patrol more in low-income areas, but whatever. But I think it's the idea of like, what are police actually doing about violent crime in preventing it? And what are they actually contributing to violent crime in terms of all the cases of excessive force, in case of police murders, and the cases of sexual assault that we see that go entirely unpunished. And And I think like it's also about like reimagining public safety that recognizes that violent crime does exist, but what are other ways that we can address it besides this like humongous force?
I'll jump in quickly. I think just to add a little bit from the legal perspective, people inflate or have like misconception about how much of crime is violent crime. In reality, most of the people in the criminal justice system and people who are incarcerated are not in for violent crime. They're in for minor drug offenses. They're in for various other nonviolent crimes, and the vast majority of them are in for nonviolent crimes. Are Black and brown people. So there's almost like a cognitive dissonance when it comes to like there's like obviously a fear about violent crime that's really just not grounded in reality. Like just go look at the numbers, go look at who are in prisons. The vast majority of them are not violent people. And then one other thing I wanted to add is that the reason why sort of the people at the forefront of this movement are pushing for defunding police, and that is their ultimate goal, is because there are no other avenues currently. There are no other legal pathways to hold cops accountable. So a great example of this is something called first let's talk about the criminal justice system. Within the context of like police officers killing Black people, killing anybody, and police officers committing offenses that would be crimes if anybody else committed them, prosecutors will simply not prosecute cops because it is so difficult to convince judges and juries to hold cops accountable. So this is the difference between the criminal and the civil system. In the criminal system, the prosecutor basically has like an enormous amount of power in deciding who gets charged with crimes. They simply do not charge cops with crimes, even when a cop did something where if anybody else did it in society, it would uncontroversially be designated a crime. So another example of how the legal system in the way that it functions protects police is something called qualified immunity, which is cabin to civil lawsuits. So you'll see a lot of the times in killer cop situations where because the prosecutor decided not to press charges, victims' families have to pursue other avenues of recourse in the civil system. So this could come in the form of a wrongful death lawsuit, which is a tort lawsuit, or an assault and battery lawsuit for when a cop's violent actions did not lead to someone's death. Or it could be sort of like more rights-based violations, like violations of due process or constitutional violations. For example, like if a police officer did not inform the victim of their Miranda rights. So in those contexts, what qualified immunity does is basically protect government officials in a way that regular citizens are not protected, where they're given kind of like a greater degree of discretion and almost like a presumption that a discretionary presumption that the decisions that government officials make are correct unless they are blatantly breaking the law. But even in instances where they are blatantly breaking the law, they're not protected. So it's a really big problem because in the criminal system, or in the criminal side, cops aren't being held accountable. In the civil side, they're also not being held accountable. And in a sense, neither of these, even if cops were to be put in jail and they did have to like pay victims damages for their offenses, neither of these things are actually going to solve the problem of someone dying at the hands of a cop. They're really the legal possible to implement within the current legal structures in place and the current people in power, and simply not adequate to really provide to prevent these things from happening in the first place. So that's why they're pursuing defunding. It's really attacking the root cause of the problem.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to wrap up our discussion on defunding the police. I think it's important for everyone who's watching to read a lot of the literature that's out there, read a lot of the statistics on what policing is. We can provide some resources at the end to do so, and sort of wrap your head around about what your own opinions are once they've been informed a little bit by some of the things we said and some of the statistics that are out there. It's really just in reimagining of whether you think our criminal justice system is fine or if it's a criminal injustice system and what we can do about it. And so just to change the conversation a little bit, we've talked about what protesters are calling for defund the police, but we had a question that came up in either Facebook or YouTube for you, Maya, about the education space. And if there were more funds given, what would you do with those funds? How could we sort of tackle systemic racism, not from the police side, but from like the education perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because as we were talking about the defunding the police, my biggest question too is, yes, there's a chance that, violence or crimes could spike, but also but my question is where are those funds actually going to go? And so if they could come, if we could get more money in education, I think I would bucket it into 3 different sectors. And I'm just thinking for my school in particular, but also just hearing from other colleagues who are also educators. So if we had more funds in schools, I would definitely want to allocate a lot of those resources to improving access to social services, especially in schools that are being redlined and are mostly serving students of color, because so many of those schools right now have security guards and have police officers there to discipline the students. And that makes no sense. Why does a police officer need to be in a school? Why are little kids growing up seeing a police officer in their school? There's so many things wrong with that. So instead, giving schools more resources to mental health providers, to social services, to social workers, to really build them up and address their social needs and their personal needs would be one aspect that I would want to give more funds to in schools. Another would be just access to resources. So now with COVID and having to our school, we had to drastically switch to distance learning, which caused huge and even bigger gap because of lack of access to tech. So now in order for kids to be successful in our American education system, they have to have access to Wi-Fi, they have to have access to tech, and because a lot of our families are struggling, they don't have that type of access. So another place where I want to put the funds is making sure our students have the same access to technology, have the same access to robust curriculum that the other schools on the greener side have. And then third, to teachers. Burnout is real. And frustration around a lot of these things is real. And so I really believe that the key to a child's success is good teachers. Because what I tell my teachers and my personal philosophy is when I'm in the classroom, yes, I can't control what's going on at your home. I can't control what happens to you when you leave, but I can control what happens in this classroom. And I can guarantee and I can do everything that I can to give you a really great education. And so really giving more money to teachers to keep them motivated, to keep them inspired, and to continue to build their skill and, delivering and at least trying to create access and creating a more equitable playing field for kids, and especially for kids of color.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. That was really insightful to know where these funds would go and your personal experience with it. So I guess we're reaching the end of time, and I wanted to wrap up our discussion with just what should we be doing? What can we do right now to keep the momentum up, to continue to reflect ourselves? So I guess my question to all the panelists is, what should we be doing to support the Black Lives Matter movement in our own capacities, depending on, what stage we are in our internalization of what's happening, and how can we keep the momentum going after the news cycle ends?
I can start. So for me, I think honestly, like what is in like my locus of control and what I really think can create generational gains is if it's just by talking about it at home. Because, if, like I said before, it starts young, and kids are constantly picking up on things, and they're hearing things, and they're experimenting, and they're trying things. So I think honestly, one of the best things that we all can do to support this movement is just to not shy away from talking about it, and talking about it with kids, because kids are the future generation. They're going to be the ones who are creating legislation. They're going to be the ones who are creating, either they're going to be like fueling this or channeling it somewhere else. So not to shy away from having these discussions with your children at home. And then if you feel discomfort yourself, like having taken that personal challenge or having the personal courage to challenge your thinking, like, why do I feel why do I feel uncomfortable right now? What is causing me to hesitate? And really being mindful of that, and just being aware of that.
I guess I can jump in. And I think, like, speaking directly to kind of like my parents' generation and people above them as well, I think as you kind of go through this journey that we've kind of all gone through already, I think through college and beyond, about kind of understanding these systemic issues and how we can best align ourselves with the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's important to remember that it's not about blame, and it's not about like, self-flagellation. I think it's important to realize also, and for us to acknowledge, like all of us panelists, that we're not like inherently enlightened compared to like the older generation. I think we just happen to have benefited from the study of American history through school, more exposure to like Black thinkers and Black authors, and more exposure to Black individuals in general. And also just, we grew up with the internet and all that stuff as well. So we've been kind of our whole lives immersed in this type of talk of social justice and things of that nature. And then also that millennials in general, we are privileged in a sense that we are not having to, not in all cases, obviously, but at least maybe I'll speak for myself, that I haven't had to struggle in the same way that my parents struggled maybe, or think about how they're going to make a life for themselves in this country, right? So we have essentially been afforded the opportunity, as I think Rupsha mentioned earlier, through our education, to have these kinds of conversations and to think about these kinds of things. So as you, the older generation, is kind of thinking about what is your role in this, I think it's important to realize that it's not about like, what's the next step, right? It's not like you are now here, you're listening. So I guess that's what I would say. And hopefully our kids will be able to fill in any gaps that we have. And that's how, like, I guess society progresses through time.
I'll add a couple things. So the first one is, and this has been said, but it really does start in your community. Start holding other people in your life accountable for things. And that isn't just the people in your family, it's the people in your profession, it's the people in your sort of like immediate South Asian community, which I know a lot of us have. The schools that your children attend, start participating more and be more vocal about standing up when you see injustice or when you hear about injustice in those schools. Maya did an amazing job of talking about how it starts young and how it is kind of embedded in the educational system. This is also true when it comes to the curriculum. So while, yes, we learned a lot about American history, so much of curriculum in schools is centered on white American history, and it is told from the perspective of white Americans. Advocate for changing that in your schools. Put your money towards these causes. We're so lucky as Indian Americans that so much of us have been lucky enough to accrue wealth. Yes, by partially because of hard work and partially because of luck and injustices and the injustices that other people have gone through. Donate to causes you care about. No one's asking you to give away all of your wealth. They're just asking you to share some of it. Being wealthy is kind of really lonely if you're not giving back to the community in some way. That's what I would add. Also, sorry, one last thing. I mentioned earlier about like going out and reading work, and this is really important to me, reading work by Black scholars and Black activists, because really all of these concepts come from those minds. Go out and read those, but also be mindful of not just consuming media and consuming literature about Black oppression, because that I find is also very damaging to society when the only images we see, the only literature we read is about slavery or about Jim Crow. Like the only movies that get nominated for Oscars that are directed by Black people are about Black oppression, where there is boundless, beautiful art by Black people that isn't about oppression, that celebrates the joy in their lives, that sees them as multifaceted human beings. Consume that art too, because it's also just as damaging to see an entire group of people as monolithically oppressed and not complex and not afforded the dignity that we would afford to people in our own community. So try to diversify what you consume as well.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I totally agree with what everyone has said, and things that I also hope to continue to work on in my own life. But I will add that like two things, like one, I think like listening is really important, particularly in like professions, like when your friends, your coworkers, or someone's talking about something they've gone through, like don't necessarily play devil's advocate and ask them like, well, maybe it was something else. Like maybe just listen to people. And I think like, as you know, maybe like our experience as South Asians could help us doing that. Cause like, we know what racism and microaggressions can feel like. And sometimes it's like not really great having everyone like prod at it. And so I think like doing that same action and being really attentive to what other people are saying and letting that, and not necessarily like taking a position of power or authority on these things. And I think the second thing is understanding the labor of activism and doing the work that we can do to contribute to that labor. And so that means like, especially like being participating in these conversations, like doing like whatever you can in your own industry or profession or your own community to like actually like do the research and like put out these materials and organize people. That is like labor and time that's often unpaid that people do. And like really being a contributor to that, I think, is another way on a very local micro scale that can be incredibly powerful if it's sustained.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for sharing. I agree with everything that you said about what the next steps are. I think it starts with reading, listening, learning, and even unlearning some of the things that we might have been taught before. And I think that's an important first step and can be coupled with actions of speaking up in instances of injustice, going to protests if you choose to experience what that's like and fight for the cause. Or it can even be things like donating to Black businesses, supporting Black businesses to help them out economically as well. And I think all of these things are great steps to do. I encourage everyone to continue this process and want to thank everyone again for joining. Thanks for sharing your views. If anyone would like, we can compile some of the resources that we have been reading and share them with all of you who are viewing as well. And hopefully that can be a good place to start. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mithali, and thank you.